So we're going to start with the presentations. I just want to read a couple of things before I pass to Deneb. So this is the second of 3 events that e-flux and I are organizing in parallel to e-flux journal issue, super community issue for the Venice Biennial. And the 3 events are related to the sub-theme in the issue that I'm guest editing on the apocalypse. And e-flux is publishing a text every day until the end of the biennial. So you can see it on the super community if you haven't seen. We'll have another event Thursday, which I recommend. And tonight we have 2 presentations with a focus on the Amazonian rainforest as a singular testing space for different modern technologies, particularly cartographic, and its role in the arduous task of the moderns in distinguishing between what is natural and what is cultural. The background for this discussion comes from recent scientific discoveries about how the Amazon rainforest, rather than being a pristine natural environment, is in fact a complex ecosystem terraformed by indigenous communities with other animals and vegetal species. This has come along with increasing research into pre-Columbian networked urbanism and indigenous agricultural techniques in the region. And yet, in contrast to such native knowledge, Amazonia has also long been a site for extraction and mapping infrastructures intent on making the region a productive site within capital. With this in mind, I'm really glad to have Deneb Kozikoski Valereto here tonight. She's at the Latin American and Iberian Cultures Department and Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University since 2011. Okay. Her research deals with the formation of the Amazon and the tropics as a physical, technical, intellectual, and epistemic frontier of modernity throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, seen at once as a potentially inexhaustible source of objects of scientific investigation and as a hostile environment that often undermines the technical expertise of the observer. The Amazon foments the creation of modalities of experience and observation that test the categories of the modern system of knowledge, its metric rule, and struggle for realism. I hope that was fair enough. Yep. We're also Skyping and is already listening to us, Paulo Tavares, who will be speaking after Deneb from Quito in Ecuador. Is a Brazilian architect and urbanist based in Quito and London. He teaches architecture at the Universidad Católica de Ecuador, Faculdade de Arquitetura, Diseño y Arte in Quito, and previously held teaching posts at the Center for Research Architecture, Goldsmiths University, and the Visual Lab in Contemporary Art Theory, also at Goldsmiths College in London. His writings are published in several magazines, and his work has been exhibited at the Center for Contemporary Arts Glasgow, in the Animism and Forensics exhibitions at the Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin, as well as Porticos in Frankfurt and the 2012 Taipei Biennial. Grounded on research-based methodologies and commitment to fieldwork, his writings and video research projects have dealt with the relations between conflict and space as they intersect within the multiscalar arrangements of cities, territories, and ecologies, with a particular focus in the Amazon region. Besides this presentation, Paulo will also be showing some video interviews he's currently undergoing on his recent research about which he'll be talking now. Just thanks to e-flux for organizing the events, and I think we can start.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro, for inviting me to participate in the discussion, and yeah, thank you the e-flux team too. My name is Deneb, and my PhD research focuses on, the ways in which technology, modern technology specifically, appeared in the Amazon in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And I'm also, as someone that studied literature and philosophy and media theory, I'm also interested in the ways in which that travel narratives of the Amazon and also changed and in a way reflected these technological changes, as well as its relationship with the rubber economy that was operative in the 19th century and the different projects that were ongoing at that time, such as, for example, the construction of a railway near the border, between the border of Brazil and Bolivia, which started being built in around 1878 and went through a phase of a pause and started being built again in 1907 and was completed in 1912. And this railway, in a way, is kind of exemplary of like projects of modernization in the Amazon and that are fomented by this kind of economic cycles that start over and over again and kind of relocate the frontiers of the Amazon. So, of course, that attracted like a lot of writers, a lot of different people, explorers, and workers as well from very different places. And the materials I deal with are visual materials, so images, maps, and some fictional and non-fictional accounts that, in a way, investigate the kind of the geophilosophical conditions of the Amazon in that period. Is this work? Yeah. So I'll start with a brief introduction, just in a way kind of situating where I'm coming from, or a bit of like what was going on in the Amazon at this time. And this first part of the talk is a bit somewhat kind of historical, and then I'm going to move to some of the images and some of the passages that I think in a way are very salient and say a lot about these new modes of perception that emerged, and to get to some theoretical questions, also like in a way pertaining to the ways in which technology and, well, indigenous peoples in the Amazon kind of meet and what happens in between the encounters of kind of, in a way, indigenous cosmologies and well, modern technology. And that is, in a way, something I'm posing as an open question at this moment. So the articulation of the Amazonian view with modern technology poses unprecedented challenges to the definition of its transformed societies and environment, its reconfigured cosmologies, and its participation in planetary capitalism. While the Amazon has never been a static or untouched environment, the introduction and unfolding of modern technology in the 19th century irreversibly created new conditions of sociability, labor, subsistence, spatial-temporal navigation, and perception. The introduction of modern technology in the Amazon has not followed homogeneous or consistent patterns that culminated in a thoroughly modernized Amazon, or that allow for a historiography of technological continuity. Since the colonial period, the territory that comprehends and surrounds the Amazon River basin, its branches, tributaries, and other rivers, has attracted conquistadors, Jesuit missionaries, pirates, explorers, and naturalists, to name a few, who participated in the generation of extraction economy, trade, and the formation of a colonial inventory of valuable goods present in environments such as cocoa, oil, and other tropical products. Eventually, sugarcane and cattle were also introduced, and so, of course, cattle is a huge problem right now, but already in the 19th century and in the 18th century, there were already places where, you know, farms were being started and places were being deforested for cattle. So while Enlightenment intellectuals in the 18th and 19th centuries, often saw stories such as El Dorado through the lens of disenchantment, the Amazon was still conceived as a realm of abundance and unexplored potential. And the myth of El Dorado is something that started circulating actually in Quito in Ecuador in 1530, and it was obviously like a very popular, in a way, kind of colonial mythology that some of the locals and indigenous peoples in Quito were saying that there was a king somewhere in the Amazon whose body was coated in gold on a daily basis, and at night he washed his body off of gold, and next day they would call him again. And not only was the king called El Dorado, but the lake in this kingdom was also called El Dorado, and the kingdom was, apparently fully kind of like made of gold. And of course, for the early modern period, with all the colonial trade that was going on, the very idea of a king coated in gold, not only for European modern European early modern politics, kind of the association of the body of the king with something like gold, which represents like pure value, also invulnerability in a way, kind of attracted a lot of other conquistadors and explorers that were going to the Amazon to look for that. That, besides the fact that there were also supposedly runaway warrior women in the Amazon. So these are some of the colonial mythologies that, with the Enlightenment in a way, were seen as being kind of, just rumors, not real. And that's also when the investigation of the Amazon on a more kind of scientific basis and disenchanted basis started, but that didn't mean in any way that that place was still not fetishized as being a realm of exorbitance. So with expeditions such as those of Lecoq-Lemine and Humboldt, many other naturalists, and especially British naturalists, were motivated to go to the Amazon and study its biological, geological, and climatic composition. In a narrative of travels on the Amazon in Rio Negro, published in 1853, Alfred Russel Wallace notes the undeveloped state of logging in the forests of the Amazon basin in comparison to Canada. And I quote, he says, "For centuries, the woodman's axe has been the pioneer of civilization in the gloomy forests of Canada, while the treasures of this great and fertile country are still unknown," end of quote. So from the mid-19th century onwards, and that was the time that Wallace and, Henry Walter Bates, who is another naturalist, he was the one kind of responsible for, or the one that came up with the idea of like animal mimicry while he was in the Amazon. That's the time that they were there, and, so that was the time that, latex, which is the white sap from rubber trees, such as the Hevea brasiliensis and the Castilloa tree, which is a species that grows also in Central America, and that indigenous people from Central America to, parts of South America already knew how to extract rubber from that. So that was the time that became the main product of extraction. And with the development of modern methods of vulcanization, to overcome rubber's material destabilization from high to low temperatures, which makes rubber brittle. So by Charles Goodyear in the United States and Thomas Hancock in England, by the 19th century, that increased the demand for rubber in the international market. And vulcanization basically means that they add sulfur to the processing of rubber. Before, in a way, you could extract it, but if you would make a boot coat out of it, if the temperatures changed a lot, the product, in a way, like it would become useless and you would have to trash it. So that, in a way, kind of made rubber finally like it turned its plasticity into something that was finally like moldable. And that also, in a way, helped link the Amazon to 19th century industrial and international financial capital. And the rubber extraction then catalyzed the formation of a vast social technical assemblage and configured the technological mediation of productive spaces within that region. The intensification of economic and demographic fluxes in the Amazon created the need for the delineation of new routes through the complex fluvial systems and the exploration of overland routes undertaken by very different kinds of travelers, explorers, and agents. Rudimentary housing structures fit for nomadic and temporary living, traces of rubber extraction in the forest, fluvial ports for steam navigation, the construction of a railway, trains in villages and posts, and emerging towns are among the infrastructure and social technical alterations registered in the Amazonian environment through the late 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. So literary and visual production by travelers, explorers, intellectuals, and technicians that experienced the Amazon in this period record and organize the semiotic codification of the Amazon into the registers of capital, cartography, fictional and non-fictional literature. The texts written by North American and European and Latin American authors plot out complex trajectories for the Amazonian territory. They function as operators that transduce and encode empirical fluxes originating from the technologically mediated contact with the Amazon. And some of the things that were introduced as in they became part of this social technical assemblage that revolved around rubber. For example, Winchester pistols and, of course, machetes, which were already introduced before. But these all in a way come together in a way not only to kind of like create the profile of the rubber tapper, who was the person that was going from rubber tree to another rubber tree, and rubber tree in a way could not be extracted on a large scale. There couldn't be a plantation because there was a natural plague that would infect the plantations. So in a way, not only the insertion of like guns and weapons, but the whole in a way process of like actually distributing the rubber until it got to the ports in Belém and until the rubber went to England, attracted like thousands of people from the northeast of Brazil, which is a very impoverished, very dry area, from other places in Latin America, and even like a lot of foreigners went there in order in a way to kind of like try to make quick money with the rubber boom. So if to Deleuze and Guattari, geophilosophy is the recognition that, I quote, thinking takes place in the relationship of territory and the earth, end of quote. These texts and images conceive and communicate the spatial relations and topologies of the rivers, lands, forests, villages, cities, and skies of the Amazon. But because many of them are also texts written by travelers and explorers, they also register movement and expose the transits between navigation and orientation, and between perception and observation. They exist between the Amazon, the actual trajectory of the travel, and the audiences that will read them. Articles such as those published by National Geographic magazine are extremely aware of how they're operating between territories and the earth, so to speak, as a sphere of international transmission and circulation of information. And of course, curiosity about the Amazon has been a very consistent thing, and there is a demand in a way kind of not only to kind of see what was going on there, but also the opportunity in a way to render that into a space where technology itself and media themselves can kind of be experimented with. So today I would like to look at some passages and images from a specific National Geographic article that is concerned precisely with the functioning of technologies of navigation and perception. In Exploring the Valley of the Amazon and the Hydroplane, which is a text published in the National Geographic magazine in 1926, Captain Albert Stevens describes the experiences, the challenges, and the encounters that him and his crew had while flying a hydroplane on the Serra Parima region. He was part of an expedition led by Alexander Hamilton Rice, who had already been to the Amazon countless times, also trying to explore and fly and go to places that no one had been before. And of course, although Columbus had already discovered America, so to speak, with the development of like new technologies, the idea of discovery itself needs to be constantly reassessed and taken to a different level, because there's only as far as a canoe or someone walking can go. So the hydroplane and the fact that, with the war, after the war, there was also a necessity to transform the airplane and the hydroplane into means of transportation that would not only be for warfare, but that would also be for leisure or for other more, let's say, exploratory purposes. This whole idea of like discovery and like expansion of the sphere of the earth in a way is taken to very different levels in the Amazon. And this same expedition also included Silvino Santos, cinematographer and photographer, and Theodor Kochberg, who was a German ethnologist from where Mário de Andrade, who wrote famous Macunaíma book, takes a lot of his information to actually write about Macunaíma. So I'm going to read this text that Stevens published as an occasion where the mutually constitutive relationships between technology and the Amazonian territory are highly salient. The question that needs to be asked is how the technologies of navigation and observation used by these travelers and explorers made possible modalities of orientation and perception in the Amazon. But this is not a question of instruments such as the theodolite, the compass, or the camera in a way, or mobility technologies such as the airplane and the railway in a way represented or framed the Amazon, since this question implies that there is an Amazon that consistently remains identical to itself beyond representation, implying a sort of being of the Amazon that remains the same regardless of the fact that it's being photographed, so to speak. So instead, the deployment of technologies of observation and mobility in that environment altered and are altered by it, functioning as techno-empirical interfaces, whose deployment is not simply meant to confirm an a priori image of the Amazon, but explore and harness the perception of it, transforming what it is. Introducing the purposes of his expedition, Stevens writes that, I quote, "We also propose to test the usefulness of a hydroplane in survey work, especially in regard to map sketching, traversing and aerial photography, scout maneuvers and reconnaissances, and in effecting communications between the various units of the party that might be temporarily separated." Let me just, there we go. Wait, this one? Where? Oh, wait. There we go. Okay, thank you. So the geographic, meteorological, climatological, and biological dimensions of the Amazon became the ideal scenario for testing and assessing technological performance. The mode of exploration that mobilizes technical-empirical interfaces, and I'm just calling them techno-empirical interfaces in a way because I want to highlight the fact that these technologies in a way are not unlike this Heideggerian idea of like in framing. They're not one-way things, and it's very clear that their sheer presence in the environment and the selective pressures that the environment exerts on them changes what the camera is. So it's one thing to take pictures under the weather conditions of Paris in the late 19th century, and another to take that technology to the Amazon where the moisture in the air and creates a bunch of obstacles to like developing the film, to even like keeping the lens without, like having the just humidity and the fog in front of it. So in a way, the Amazon, the idea of like the limit of technology in a way that was suggested in the description of the talk is not so much where it ends, so to speak, but where does technology need to go to for its own limits in a way to be, for the limits to be expanded, so to speak, and be revealed. And I'm also calling them empirical, obviously, because it's not only that they create an image or that they create a way of perceiving the Amazon, but the very engagement with them for the people that were traveling creates a set of like experiences around that orient around the restraints or the affordances that the technology has. So for the hydroplane, that was a great place to go. I mean, there were very few maps of like the rivers of the Amazon that would be useful for someone flying an airplane and be able to land it on the water. So there's a lot of risk involved, of course, and the whole idea of like exploration that was in a way renewed with the emergence of these technologies is intrinsically related to like a kind of ideal balance between risk and between safety. Because for these travelers, in a way, if they would keep themselves within the kind of like safe boundaries and like knew we're only flying around cities or we're only flying over places that they had radio communication, there would never be the sort of like exposure and the kind of like relationship with the possibility of accident that would be necessary for that medium in a way to even prove itself, so to speak, and also for the technicians themselves. So this image of Silvino Santos turning a tangle of roots into a tropical photography laboratory, which comes from Stephen's article, shows how the introduction of the camera in the Amazon, in the absence of structures that could provide enough darkness and low temperatures, alters the very procedures of developing film. So new selective pressures on the body of the camera emerge from the environment, demanding the very idea of what a camera is to be reassessed as to incorporate these pressures. And apparently he could only develop and like work on it very late at night, like after midnight, and a lot of the film was lost in this process. This is another interesting image that says toasting the aerial camera before the day's flight. The atmosphere of the tropics contains so much moisture that water condenses upon a cool glass surface. It was necessary, therefore, to heat the camera gently before the fire in the early morning, so that when it was installed in the hydroplane, the lens would not fog. Yeah, it in a way kind of, I mean, it shows the kind of like practices and improvisations that emerge out of this. This is an image also taken from the hydroplane, 5,000 feet above the ground. And this is the kind of like emblematic, now we see it as emblematic picture of the encounter of the waters of the Rio Negro and the Solimões. The Rio Negro is the darker patch and the Solimões is the lighter. And it says the black waters on the right of the Negro are mingling with the yellow waters of the Amazon. At that point, the Amazon is actually called Solimões, but a lot of people call that part of the river also Amazon because it does meet, it branches out into the Amazon. This is the way that water appears to the traveler gazing down from the steamship. It doesn't show the rest of the caption, but he's basically saying that from the steamship you would also see that. What is interesting here in a way is that this image is like meant to show a natural phenomenon that is visible from the water level, but that has to be codified through the technologically powered perspective of the hydroplane and aerial photography in order for it to be seen from elsewhere. Interestingly, Stephen says that this is also how the water appears from a steamship, creating a perspectival patchwork of images and views from different means of accelerated mobility. The perspectival patchwork made possible for the mediation of technical-empirical interfaces in the early 20th century is of critical importance because prior to that, explorers, naturalists, and travelers in the Amazon relied on walking, on ships, on maps, canoes, and on indigenous peoples as means of orientation and transportation. They were sometimes carried by indigenous people when they were not rowing or helping them find their way. And, well, this is very important also because getting lost in the Amazon was, of course, very easy and within the modern paradigm in a way of orientation and of like a sort of like linear telos that is in a way based on certain ideas about like what a landscape is, a sort of like linear arrangement of a landscape. It was not hard to imagine how something that was not getting lost was already getting lost to an European traveler. And Euclides da Cunha, who is a Brazilian intellectual and engineer who traveled through the Amazon in 1905, so before these images were taken, he remarked on the limitations and shortcomings of the research of many of the naturalists and travelers who had previously investigated portions of the Amazon, but did not venture beyond their fields of specialization, both in terms of like how they only focused on one discipline, either like biology or looking at geological accidents, but also knowing how at that time to do research, they had literally to confine themselves sometimes to one specific region, and therefore, like, in a way, it was as if a lot of the comments he makes on it was that there was no global view of the Amazon. No one could actually define or understand what the Amazon is because all of these studies and all of the travelers only managed to cover portions of it. And of course, the very idea of like traveling through the entire Amazon and actually having a global view of that is itself in a way kind of an illusion produced by a certain desire for comprehension. Speaking of the experience in the eastern Amazon, which is characteristically flat, Euclides da Cunha conceives the horizontal spatio-temporal dimension saying, I quote, "And because of this lack of vertical dimension, essential to imparting a sense of life to a landscape, within a few hours the observer tires in the face of the unbearable monotony and begins to notice that their gaze is less and less frequently directed to that endless horizon as empty and undefined as that of the sea." End of quote. And this is, of course, I mean, being 1905, it's after, in a way, like years of like reading Romanticism in a way, having a passion for depths and pioneering in a way, images in a way that are portrayed from high peaks. And that is obviously like not something that is given, it's something that itself has to be crafted. This could be reversed in a way and say, well, maybe you haven't explored horizontality enough. Maybe if verticality was already taken to its extremes, horizontality itself still needs to be explored. And this is also interesting to think the ways in which people say that they're deep in the jungle, even though the jungle might be flat. And lots of portions of the Amazon are, don't have hills, don't actually afford this like panoramic perspective that would give a sense of relief, or like I can see it from somewhere else. I'm not bound by the ground perspective. But interestingly, when you say deep in the jungle, horizontality and verticality kind of collapse. The hydroplane expeditions in the 1920s does seem to fulfill the lack of vertical dimension that would be obtained only from the higher peaks of the Amazon, but that would nevertheless remain static. However, these images do not necessarily result in a familiarization with the Amazon as a territory. They're not just confirming a preconceived image of the encounter of the waters. Technologies such as photography, the airplane, and the railway produce images, experiences, and perceptions that propel the conserved image of the Amazon beyond any imaginary identity. The fact that these technologies involve a manipulation of speed and modulation of space-time, particularly with the airplane and the train, results in a sort of like alienation of the Amazon from the human gaze. This is also, I think, quite important in a way, and I think it's a question that has a kind of a theoretical possibility in a way that still needs to be explored, specifically in terms of an environment that is conceived thoroughly as being, in a way, organic, as from the late 80s in a way into the 90s, also with the gold rush that the Amazon went at that time. There was, of course, that's when internationally a lot of people were like talking about the preservation of the Amazon again and like renewing that vocabulary of conservation, as if that has to be kept in a way like pristine and wholesome. And interestingly, a lot of the images that are used to show the dangers and the consequences of means of extraction and cattle, of like soil plantations, themselves rely on like technologies in a way that offer a totally like kind of in human perspective. I mean, that it's only possible in a way through the combination of human manipulation of technology. So far I've been referring to the Amazon territory as comprehending the Amazon River Basin and its surroundings. And the impasse with defining a territory is that the disciplines that provide the vocabulary and concepts that map onto a territory, if we're to distinguish the map from the territory, are themselves liable to entrapment by the epistemic and political protocols, and they kind of become geophilosophically inert, so to speak. Because if you think of environment, there are already a set of assumptions, and a lot of these in a way create a sort of organization of the Amazon that doesn't always kind of manage to account for the heterogeneity that is created at that place. So a lot of the terminology like environment, ecosystem, region even, gain and juxtapose more maps, but they lose sight of the territory and the necessity to intensify and deepen our engagement with it. So an Amazon region can be geopolitically mapped into a territory and reveal a transnational, multi-jurisdictional, and a multi-ethnic site, which it is. But in order to balance the emphasis on integrity by terms such as environment, ecosystem, and region, and to draw attention to the open, shifting, and liminal spatial, temporal, cosmological, and techno-civilizational horizons of the Amazon, the concept of the frontier is to be considered as an intrinsic component of this analysis. The term frontier obviously has a very long history, especially in the United States, the westward expansion, and there have been a lot of comparisons between the American frontier and the Latin American frontier. But this term is a term that reflects the instability, the discontinuity, and the historicity of incursions of modern technology in the Amazon throughout modernity. It also brings to the fore the fact that the proliferation and emergence of frontiers in the Amazon is not, as Poe Little claims in Amazonia, territorial struggles on perennial frontiers, and I quote, a one-time occurrence, a definitive arrival of modernity, but rather a perennial phenomenon spurred by the constant arrival of ever new social groups, and here I would add not only new social groups, but new technologies and new modes of expertise that also transform that place. Seeking ever new resources and their subsequent reterritorialization based upon differential ways of appropriating geographical space. This phenomenon has been going on for centuries, and in recent decades it seems to be accelerating, end of quote. Frontiers of the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century show is that the arrival of socio-technical assemblages of expertise, labor, and technology in the Amazon was not a unilateral process in which Amazonian nature was in a passive position in relation to technology. In The Optic of the State, Visuality and Power in Argentina and Brazil, argues that, I quote, nature turns into a frontier once it is reached by a technological and symbolic apparatus that has removed the obstacles and by space. End of quote. Countering Underman's understanding of the emergence of frontier, I propose that a locus becomes a frontier by harnessing potential vectors and opportunities for the development of social, technical, and economic assemblages. So this is not to say that technology dominates nature, but it's precisely the contrary. That precisely at the frontier challenges our capacity to assess technologies in terms of efficiency and optimality. Because the whole point of, in a way, removing, in a way, the airplane from a context of infrastructural continuity, so to speak, is, in a way, to have the airplane itself be challenged, so to speak. And to see kind of like what fails. So frontiers expose technologies to selective pressures which shape their destinies. Once technology is taken from the infrastructural context where it was designed and where it worked, all sorts of unpredictable effects and difficulties are produced from the interaction with the frontier space. And this is also where the literature of like civilization and barbarism in Latin America comes in as an interesting, historical and theoretical addition to this discussion, because at the frontier, it's also the place where not only technology is arriving, like let's say abruptly. You don't have this, in a way, you can't tell a continuous history of technology in the Amazon. And I would say, yes, you can. You wouldn't be able to do that in industrial, developed Northern Europe or in North America either, except that with modernity itself being kind of having this process of like exporting machines and exporting knowledge, so to speak, to that environment, the parameters of assessment of whether a technology works are always from the place of origin, so to speak. So the whole idea is in a way to also kind of reverse that and in a way look at how like colonialism and techno-civilizational expansion is in an intrinsic contact with barbarism. And at the frontier, like the white man himself cannot always be distinguished from like the indigenous person. And a lot of the things that come to define these cultures and these cosmologies materially kind of collapse and start to kind of interbreed, for better, for worse, and of course with a lot of violence involved in this. So the understanding of technology as removing obstacles posed by nature is misleading because it takes for granted that a removal of obstacles is equivalent to progress, as if, in a way, that would like be an like immediate indication of like the functioning, the optimal functioning of technology. And this, in a way, also leaves unquestioned the linearity of the narrative of technological modernization. As the early 20th century Amazon reveals, obstacles posed in and by space are rarely removed. If anything, the incursions of technology are means of finding and bringing to the fore ever more intricate spaces of productive flux. The effects of the ephemeralization of the obstacles that emerge from the encounter between technology and its sites of deployment become part of the conceptual and technical horizon of technological development itself. To challenge the idea that a frontier is produced once technology removes obstacles posed by nature, we need to ask how technological failures themselves function and how they're altering and being altered by the interaction with the Amazonian frontier space. So this is another passage from the Stevens text, which is quite interesting because, I mean, take a look at it. He's saying, at Caracari Rapids between Vista Alegre and Boa Vista, gasoline and oil had been transshipped and carried as far as Boa Vista in launches. But beyond these points, the rapids became so rough that we had to rely upon canoes to advance the hydroplane's fuel and lubricant. Sometimes we used a portable motor canoe, and sometimes, particularly in the upper stretches, Indian rowers. The gasoline was in 5-gallon cans, which had to be carried around falls and the worst rapids. The heavy loads were nearly sunk the canoes more than once. And only 50% of the fuel cargo taken on board at Boa Esperança ever reached the Parima-Aracasa junction, 250 miles upstream. This passage not only displays the mobilization of different means of navigation and of transportation that were necessary to bring gasoline to the hydroplane deep into the Amazon territory, but it also shows how the success of the operation is distributed and fragmented over canoes, over portable motors, and Indian rowers. This discontinuous and open-ended dynamic articulates a negative space between the maps of technoscientific expertise, the blueprints, the manuals, and the actual infrastructure that supports the hydroplane, and the fluvial terrain, where accidental interactions review thresholds of interoperability of human labor and technology. In an earlier instance where the hydroplane and the crew faced other challenges, Stevens says that, I quote, by the most strenuous work day and night, amid swarms and gnats of mosquitoes and in beating rain, Hinton and Vilshusen stripped off the veneer and replaced it with solid planking, because the airplane literally was about to actually have holes in it. 2 days later, with the help of 20 Indians, the hydroplane was eased into the water. End of quote. These passages make the obstacles posed by the environment and the distance from techno-civilizational infrastructure salient, and it will be limiting to read the expression of these difficulties for a triumphalist rhetoric of the civilized man's victory over nature. The participation of indigenous peoples in these operations was tantamount to their functioning, as the indigenous subject is approached through a combination of amicable exchange through trade, functional utility in operations, and anthropological curiosity, of course. The analysis of the dynamics between technologies in the Amazonian territory must consider how different technologies and activities create modes of engagements with indigenous people. While the incursion of technology in the Amazon cannot be extricated from the broader and ongoing process of expansion of techno-civilizational infrastructures after the colonial period, and with the advent of steam technologies, the telegraph, the radio, airplane, the flight of the hydroplane and the construction of the railway or of hydroelectric power plants have very different effects on the Amazonian environment and are also affected by it in particular ways. The history of the Madeira-Mamoré Railway near the border between Brazil in Bolivia, convoluted and fascinating as it is, offers some clues on the question of technology in the Amazon and its thoroughly problematic relationship with indigenous and local modes of existence. So this is a passage by a text, from a text by Neville Craig from 1907, who was someone who was involved in the construction of this railway. And here he's describing kind of like the very kind of precarious ceremony that Colonel Earl Church, who was actually the head of the construction and trying to like get investors, trying to bring people, being kind of like the diplomatic man, literally the kind of Kurtz of the Amazon. The ceremony around like starting and finding the location around it. What's interesting here is the description of the half-clad Indian boatman, because he's saying on November 1st, the site of the railway terminus was selected, and in the presence of the entire party, consisting mainly of half-clad Indian boatmen, in the heart of a vast tropical wilderness, 1,500 miles from civilization, where the interior country was absolutely unexplored and except by primitive savages uninhabited, Colonel Church went for the rude ceremony of turning the first sod for a railway that with the faith of a Columbus he firmly believed and fondly hoped would open to immigration and to the commerce of the world a country unsurpassed in latent wealth by any unoccupied territory of equal extent in the face of the globe. It's a very dense passage, but it also shows in a way how the indigenous in a way is not necessarily in contradiction with the construction of the railway. In fact, he's like the audience of it. It's interesting in a way to see that it is in situations like this that these cosmologies are kind of collapsing with each other. And it also shows, which this is something in a way intrinsic to like the proliferation of the frontiers, how in a way this process is a very fragmented one. The partial state of undress does not in a way like contradict this project, but it attests to it. It's almost like a historical mark of where the project is at, so to speak. And in a way, they also contribute to kind of seeing the ritualization aspect of it. Because without an audience, there wouldn't, this process, this whole event in a way would remain like unwitnessed or would almost like become itself kind of probably mythological. While the railway was to bypass an area of hard navigation and allow the transit of people and rubber, forging a sense of direction and communication between spaces, the disconnectedness from large centers turned the Madeira-Mamoré railway into a veritable technological civilizational ruin, because as soon as this railway was operative for some years, but it very soon began to kind of, its degeneration was faster than its use, so to speak. And Francisco Foote-Hartmann wrote, has a very interesting kind of insight on this in his book about the ghost train, Modernity in the Jungle. That's my English translation of the title. And he says that in itself, the railway in the forest would not necessarily be an engine of development. There were enough reasons of equal importance for the contrary, for a route that conducted from nowhere to nowhere. So this is an image also in the Stevens text that is quite interesting, because he's saying that this is one of those also by now kind of recurrent images that you see of like uncontacted tribes or people lost in the middle of the jungle. And he's saying the hydroplane alighted in the river after circling several times over the camp. The Indians, realizing that they're, I don't know, I can't read it, but he's saying, not that word, but he's saying that realizing that there was something above them, they started to come out. And the other pictures that kind of stage this encounter in a way are also indications of how far they managed to go into the jungle and how in a way they're like charting territories that no one had ever been before. The semiotically transformed images of indigenous subjects by aerial photography abstract the territory from its environmental dimensions, which is the dwelling of indigenous people. In a way, this is a modern, like a contemporary image of the same scene, so to speak, showing other uncontacted tribes. And the interesting thing is, of course, that they're also looking up. But the effect that these images have, in a way, is to kind of separate the ground, in a way, from the fact that it is a dwelling. In a way, it abstracts it from its groundedness. Aerial photography detaches the forest from its ground by collapsing the canopy into its understory and abstracting the gaze from the inhabitable spaces of the forest. And the indigenous subject that we see for the aerial vision of the airplane, they're not just indigenous. The aerial shot dissimulates a global view simply by being taken from above, but it is not the case that the aerial experience of the Amazon and the aerial shot are the ultimate horizons of the limit of perception of what the Amazon is or can be. Hence the question, does the aerial view create proximity with or distance from the Amazonian outer canopy? Whether we think we see it better or whether the aerial view undoes previously retained images of the Amazon, whether it has an alienating effect. The question that needs to be posed is not only how to arrange these different visual registers, these semiotic regimens where these pictures are being created and when they're circulating, and also the way they're codifying the Amazon, the modes of perception they're creating, but also in a way how we're deploying them and for what purposes. The anthropic position I call the alien indigenous, so to speak, is produced at the intersection of technical empirical interfaces through photography, through the airplane, with frontier spaces. The indigenous people seen above are at once absolutely bound to the territory, creating an intensification of indigeneity, of nativity, and alien because in bridging distances, the imperial technology of the airplane creates the possibility of civilizational expansion, deterritorializing the indigenous by making them alien or even incidental to that space. The frontier that opens a window into the indigenous territory and another to the technologically mediated sky cannot easily be shut by assuming an essential incompatibility between indigenous ways of living and technological modernity. This suggests an irreversibility of technological incursion that much theory, scholarship, and political thought somewhat neglects when in a way it goes directly to a sort of like defense of the native without actually analyzing the mediatic and technological conditions that are at work there. And this is from Star Trek, which, of course, read in the sequence is very interesting because when they arrive in Star Trek to prevent, if I'm not mistaken, in this planet, to prevent, I think, the explosion of the volcano. Is that it? I think so. I mean, you start seeing, I think, some of the characters running, and then the alien indigenous people show up, and they succeed. I think Spock succeeds in preventing the natural disaster that was going to happen. Techno-civilizational vectors have irreversibly opened and excavated perceptual and environmental dimensions that make indigenous cosmologies and techno-civilization temporality collide, triggering an inevitable rearrangement of orders. The generalizations entailed by the claim that indigenous cosmologies and techno-civilization are incompatible are not only unfeasible, but the heterogeneous and accelerated rate of technological development in the Amazon demands a more rigorous study of the transformations that the techno-Amazonian topos is undergoing. Poverilius studies of the relations between war and cinema, of which aerial photography is an intrinsic component, offer an insightful but chilling proposition, and I quote, "Indeed, the military term theater weapon, though itself outmoded, underlines the fact that the history of battle is primarily the history of radically changing fields of perception. In other words, war consists not so much in scoring territorial, economic, or other material victories as in appropriating the immateriality of perceptual fields." End of quote. And I'll end also with this image. It's also an image from this article. And it's the Maco Indians of the Rio Uraricoera listening to a talk on education by Judge Gary broadcast from Pittsburgh. And apparently, on setting of the flashlight, the Indians suddenly departed, headsets and all, but fortunately, the plugs pulled loose. From a distance, so they were not entirely attached to it. From a distance of 25 feet, they were coaxed back again. Jazz music meant nothing to them, neither did songs or recitations. They got more kicked out of an ordinary mouth organ or harmonica than out of the radio. Wade and Bow considered a mouth organ, that's what he's saying on the bottom, a mouth organ would be a more useful object for trade with the indigenous people than anything else. And I think, this image in a way is a sort of like attempt, of course, to kind of like see, to satisfy a sort of like curiosity about the effect of this technology. And at the same time, in a way, I think creating, raising the question of at least, or the recognition that contact and isolation in a way are not things that exist in like two extremes. And the real question then is to ask like, what is going to happen with the collapsed cosmologies? I think Pedro's article on the falling sky suggests that, and David Kopenawa's account now written with Bruce Albert, which is called The Falling Sky, in a way has very much to do with that. And you can see that Kopenawa himself is already in narrating his experiences as a Yanomami and, of course, witnessing some of the effects of the gold rush. The account itself already integrates some of the effects of the extraction and, of course, the incursion of technology in the Amazon in the indigenous cosmology. It's not like they're, of course, aware of it, and the whole language is being developed to talk about that. So I'll, end here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Pedro, very much for the invitation. Thank you, every one of you from e-flux. What I'm going to show you today is a project called Archaeology of Violence. This project has different dimensions, different forms of expression of manifesting itself, both in a more art-related environment, as well as it's very much connected to the political situation on the ground, insofar as it deals with a very specific case of genocide of an indigenous group of Central Amazonia. And there is a sort of legal political dimension to the work that you are going to see. And also it is manifested in different manifestations, installations, archive research, etc., and so on. Since we are doing this talk through Skype, which is not the ideal situation, so I decided to show, to do a kind of presentation based more on the archival aspect of this project and show very slowly several images and comment on these images. So I think this would be a easier way to follow the presentation. And I hope we can, work with that. Pedro, are you with the slide on the screen, the first one? Okay. Perhaps to connect with Deneb's presentation and to talk, to introduce what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I think these modes of perception that she was talking about, this relation of modes of vision, of modes of cartography in the most different sorts of fields of knowledge, botany, biology, geography, geology, anthropology. When they enter into the Amazonian territory, what is interesting is that they are not only mediating a relation between us humans or modern society or Western society and the territory of Amazonia itself, but they are always located in a kind of much more broader question, which is related to the way we organize the world. Right, which is related to the way we perceive nature, the relations between nature and culture. They are always embedded in some sort of cosmological question, one could say. Right, all the scientists that are going to these areas, they are always asking a kind of more a larger question about the way that the world functions and the way that we sort of organize the world in a certain way. And what is interesting about Amazonia also is that it's this sort of encounter, this frontier encounter with this modes of perception, and as Deneb was saying, they are always challenged, but not only in their technological construction or the technological limits, but one could say also on their epistemic ones, right? So modernity is questioned in its very foundations, so to say. And one of the categories that Amazonia challenged, and this relates specifically to my work because I'm an architect, is the very category of the city itself, right? So one of this, if the city can be seen as a technological space to connect to the theme of the lecture of the table, one can say that the city itself, the very category of the city, as much as a material form as well as a political form, is challenged by Amazonia. And this is what I'm going to show or try to address perhaps today. Okay, so let's move to the first slide. So the first image in this archaeology of the archive is a photograph of the ground zero of Brasilia, Brazil's modernist capital, which was built in the middle of the Brazilian territory, right in the Midwest plateaus. So it was a sort of frontier city in a way. And if you could pass to the second slide, Pedro, please. Okay, we have slide number 2, the same image with a phrase on the top, right? Okay, so this phrase is what the urbanist who drew Brasilia, what he wrote about this plan, which Brasilia is designed as a cross, as you can see in this image of the ground zero, is the first sort of trace of this cross shape which the city is designed. And he would say it was born out of the primary gesture of one who marks or takes possession of a place, to act crossing at the right angle, the very sign of the cross. Now, this first image, what I want to show with this is that there is a kind of very intimate relation between modernity and colonialism that's going to inform the whole process of modernization throughout the 20th century and somehow be structural to the very idea of nation building and state crafting in entire South America, I would say, but particularly in Brazil because of its territorial dimensions. So let's stay with this idea that modernity and colonialism, they are somehow intimately and structurally related. The next slide, please. So the second image in this archive comes from this book written in 1967 by General Goberi da Couto Silva. Goberi da Couto Silva was one of the most important intellectuals of the national security doctrine that was implemented throughout Latin America during the Cold War, where military regimes were governing practically the entire country. The entire continent. And this is a sort of very important treatise for what was conceived as, what those military governments conceived as modernization. Next slide, please. So Goberi, in this book, he developed something that is called a maneuver for the integration of the national territory. And he organized the territory, as you can see in those maps, as the Brazilian territory as sort of peninsulas, somehow articulated. And on the left-hand side, you can see this, that he would call Amazonia a giant island that somehow was disconnected from these other peninsulas that formed the Brazilian territory. So it's a very sort of geopolitical language that emerged from the 19th century and somehow continues to the 20th century. And on the second map, on the right-hand side, you can see that he had all these bubbles that all these frontiers outposts that would surround Amazonia, and then from Brasilia, from the Midwest plateaus, this maneuver of territorial integration would be launched. Next slide, please. So this is to say that that ideology of modernity, coloniality, that is somehow embodied in the capital Brasilia, when Brazil becomes a military dictatorship, it also becomes increasingly militarized and somehow increasingly framed in the counterinsurgent doctrines of the Cold War. So it's going to become increasingly violent. After the military takes power in Brazil in a US-backed military coup, what the government is going to do is to implement this maneuver of territorial integration designed by Golbery in an effective plan which was called Operation Amazonia. Now, Operation Amazonia, the first act of this operation is to define a political jurisdiction which is called Legal Amazonia. Now, as you can see in this map, are we seeing a map? Okay. Now you can see in this map this artificial political jurisdiction somehow overlaps with the very biological or biogeographical composition of Amazonia. There is almost an overlapping between what is nature and what is this artificial political jurisdiction. If you pass on the slide, you would see this image better in this slide number 6. Yeah. So what's interesting by this kind of overlapping between nature and politics, let's say, on this kind of collapse on the territory, is that by projecting this nearly symmetrical relation between the political jurisdiction and the natural one, it enabled to conceptualize certain types of territorial strategy that would be deployed at the scale of Amazonia. And this is somehow a kind of novelty in the colonization of Amazonia, and somehow also very much connected to this rapid development of technologies related to the military-industrial complex during the Cold War, right? As you know, in earth science, they're going to call this period, the period of the Cold War, the Great Acceleration, because it was the time when resources were consumed in a kind of exponential scale. So this overlapping is going to allow to deploy a strategy at the scale of Amazonia. Next slide, please. So the second action of this Operation Amazonia was to conduct a kind of very extensive remote sensing survey using technology developed during the Second World War. Specifically, this image, this archival image, it's a radar image which doesn't look like it contains much information, but in fact it stores a lot of information in different sort of layers. And together with this extensive aerial survey, if we can move to another slide, number 8, please. What we see is that they also conducted on-the-ground survey, right? So trying to verify the very geology of the area on the ground. So these two dimensions, this sort of very extensive map, and on the other hand, a kind of very intensive map, you can see all the dots, that all the forest clearings that they had to carve in the middle of Amazonia on this kind of very little map on the right bottom of the image. So this idea of these two dimensions of mapping on the ground and on the air somehow produces sort of deep cartography, a deep image of the terrain. And if we can move the 3 next slides very slowly, please, Pedro. So you see that they are going to produce this very color codings, these different color codings of the land, right? Which represents different features of the landscape, different dimensions of this deep sort of environment which Amazonia is becoming now. So this is a proper environmental perspective of the Amazonia, although it's not connected to the ecological turn of the 70s, but had to a sort of, we could say, a sort of Malthusianism that would see this terrain as a kind of space that could feed in certain way the global economy, the global capitalist economy, and the military-industrial complex, and of course develop Brazil somehow. So based on this cartography, on this deep image of the Amazonian environment, the military is going to deploy this large-scale, basin-wide plan of territorial design that's going to produce the most radical transformation, both in the social and environmental territory of Amazonia, observed perhaps since the arrival of Europeans. They say it's a giant project of colonization, and one of the most ambitious, perhaps, a project of spatial planning witnessed during the Cold War. So, Pedro, if you could do a sort of very smooth transition between slide 13 and 26. I'm going to show you very rapidly just some images of this project of territorial colonization that are part of this archive that I have been collecting. And as you can see, there's also this idea of modernization of the territory of Amazonia that draws very much from a language, a kind of modernist language that was consolidated with Brasilia, but somehow to a completely other scale, and in fact also connected to, structurally connected to this idea of colonization. That is to say, to be modern was somehow to colonize the territory. Can you say which slide are you, Pedro, now, please? Okay. You can move to the 26. So you see there is this, they were planning several cities in the middle of the jungle, all connected by these road corridors. And this was the period which Brazil experienced what it's called its own green revolution, right? This kind of radical modification of the soil that allowed Brazil to become one of the world's largest exporters of soybean in this area, specifically concentrated at the southern edges of Amazonia. Where we are? Okay. Of course, that those spaces that the military were occupying, they were not empty spaces. They were, of course, populated. This image of this archive is one of the most remarkable maps that I've seen about the indigenous territories in Brazil, or perhaps what we'd call Amerindia. So what we see in this map, what's kind of remarkable, is it's a very diverse space, and also the way that this indigenous population are somehow organized, because it's a very fluid map, right? You see that it's a lots of contact between these people, and also very fluid. And we have to imagine that this map was made in 1944. So, most of the indigenous people had already faced dramatic populational demographic reductions. So what we see here is a sort of plurinational territory, right? It's a territory that cannot be framed by one single nation state. And somehow, in order to accomplish this plan of colonization of Amazonia, the military had to de-plurinationalize this territory. That is to say, it had to flatten it down in terms of its social diversity in order for it to accommodate its national developmentalist project. So this process of de-plurinationalization, we can move to another slide. And this process is going to be conducted by a specific agency, which is called the Service for the Protection of the Indians. It's a state agency whose mandate was to contact these people, and using a technique of spatial and population control developed during the colonial system, was to reduce these populations to state-controlled settlements. We can move to the next slide. You see here, this was a strategy to contact indigenous people, this sort of gift giving. They would fly to these areas, contact these people. We can move to the other slide, number 30. And here is one of the maps, also in 1946, of the Service for the Protection of the Indians, with this hundreds of indigenous posts or bases of this agency, which they use to contact those people, but also to concentrate them around it in order to open their lands for the colonization project, as well as somehow to transform them in Brazilians. And what is remarkable about this agency is that it's in parallel to this process of pacification. It also had a center of studies, which produced a remarkable archive of a remarkable audio-video archive about this frontier encounters. And just for you to have an idea of this archive, I'm going to show a little video, some excerpts of this material I've been collecting, which are now about the Service for the Protection of the Indians, which are now stored in the Museum of the Indian in Rio de Janeiro. Can you play the video, Pedro, please? Is it okay? Can you guys follow? Is it fine or? Okay.
It's just fundamentally different, and I think that it is a form.
Cebuino, meio sangue aqui criado, não poucas vezes segue o caminho para outros postos, para aí iniciar ou melhorar a produção. Um fator principal na vida de um posto indígena, a sede provisória ou definitiva de um estabelecimento que o Serviço de Proteção aos Índios funda em território indígena para atuar junto da tribo local. Chama-se posto indígena a sede provisória ou definitiva de um estabelecimento que o Serviço de Proteção aos Índios funda em território indígena para atuar junto da tribo local. Os postos indígenas, segundo a sua natureza e local onde se encontram, se subdividem em postos de atração, o primeiro passo para atrair o selvícola ao nosso meio de vida. Postos de alfabetização e tratamento caracterizam-se pela assistência ao índio, extremamente influenciado pela proximidade dos civilizados. Postos de nacionalização são aqueles por intermédio dos quais o SPI oferece ao índio o máximo de educação, proporciona técnicas de trabalho e conduzindo-o progressivamente para sua integração na sociedade brasileira. Em certos estágios culturais, os índios estão mais próximos da pecuária que da agricultura intensiva. O SPI, surpreendendo esta situação, proporciona ao índio a criação de gado de puro sangue com os postos de criação. A irradiação das atividades nacionais do Serviço de Proteção aos Índios sublimam-se na fixação do índio à gleba brasileira, atraindo-os do seu nomadismo e nacionalizando-o dentro do território nacional com os postos de fronteira. Uma pleiade de células preocupadas com a defesa e adaptação do nosso índio. São esses núcleos, dirigidos pelas inspetorias regionais, localizadas em Manaus, Belém, São Luís, Recife, Campo Grande, Cuiabá, Curitiba, Goiânia e Porto Velho, por sua vez subordinados à sede geral no Rio de Janeiro, com suas seções de administração, seção de orientação e assistência e seção de estudos. Deste vasto conjunto, focamos 2 postos de nacionalização na zona nordeste do estado de São Paulo, Curte, Nimoendaju e Icatu. Em meio de zona outrora agitada por lutas contra o índio, que se defendia contra a invasão de suas terras, está hoje localizado este posto com os seus índios Caingang apaziguados. A casa do posto é a sede da administração do SPI. É em geral a primeira habitação construída por civilizados em terras de índios, iniciando a mais árdua tarefa e que tem nas crianças os elementos indígenas que mais depressa aceitam os costumes dos civilizados. A pecuária é um dos principais elementos da manutenção de um posto indígena. É também um ótimo veículo para introduzir a noção econômica entre os índios. O melhor gado zebuíno, meio sangue, aqui criado, não poucas vezes, segue o caminho para outros postos, para aí iniciar ou melhorar a produção. Um fator principal na vida de um posto indígena torna-se a agricultura. É ela que organiza o trabalho, ensina técnicos, produz renda, insinua os costumes civilizados e encaminha o índio para a civilização rural brasileira. Contrário ao sistema adotado em outros postos, o índio neste posto já se torna um colono. De longe chegam as crianças, atravessando a...
Estamos sobrevoando o Planalto do Brasil Central, onde se encontra a Serra do Roncador. Coberto de uma vegetação rala e de terras pobres para a agricultura, é contudo um manancial perene para a criação de gado, água em abundância e campos intermináveis. Vemos algumas das malocas dos Chavantes, índios que já se tornaram lendários pela bravura com que defendem suas terras da penetração dos brancos. Os Chavantes, há bem pouco, fizeram seu primeiro encontro amistoso com a turma de pacificação do Serviço de Proteção aos Índios. Depois de mais de 100 anos, se terem afastado dos civilizados por serem pelos mesmos traídos. Rumamos agora para as terras onde nasce o grande Xingu.
Pedro? Okay, slide 32, yeah? Okay, so what happened, you see in that film, right? 2 moments of these fronts of attraction. One is going to the Chavant land, which is really far away, so they are in the kind of first contact moment. And much more closer to the coast in São Paulo, you see how this disciplinary regime, how this really sort of panopticon regime function to settle what they call nomadic indigenous people, to ruralize those populations, to turn them into fixated, localized, settled rural works. And this conception that the very jungle itself had, or this interlands, they have to be ruralized and these people sort of integrate into the state. What happens is that when the military assume power, this sort of pacification colonial strategy turns into a genocidal politics. This image is one of the documents that emerged very recently, when Brazil established its National Truth Commission, a truth commission to investigate the crimes committed by the dictatorship. This was one of the first reports that tried to map the violence that was happening in those posts. Just for you to have an example, one of these posts, these indigenous posts shown in this film, it's called Icatu, although this film is of course a sort of state propaganda, a kind of propaganda of modernization, which at the same time reveals a kind of colonial process. What is the sort of other stories of this post is that it became a sort of penal colony for various indigenous peoples, and these people were somehow systematically enslaved and tortured in those posts. That is to say, it became a sort of genocidal politics, and this document is one of the documents that reveal this. But that is to say, we can move to the next slide, please. That's to say that I've been working on, and this is everything that I talked until now was a sort of just prologue for the real project, let's say, a kind of archival prologue. And I've been working in a case of one of these populations that were massacred by during the 70s and 80s due to this process of this politics of pacification. Can we move to 34, please? So they were called Waimiri Atuari, and the government somehow did a very organized, planned strategy of pacification of the Waimiri Atuari people. And I'm going to show a series of maps now that narrate this politics of pacification. What happens is that in this territory, it's a very rich territory in minerals. It's situated close to the capital, Manaus. So it's a sort of very strategic location, and it became a very strategic point, or what the government called development pole in this kind of basin-wide planning of colonization development of Amazonia. So therefore, to implement a series of projects such as cattle range, agricultural plantations, mines, and large hydroelectric dams, the government had to remove those populations from these areas. And that's precisely what they did. I'm going to narrate more or less by the following maps. 35, please. Okay, this is a Landsat, a satellite image of the Waimiri Atuari territory in 1970. And if we move to the next image, 36, I'm sorry I don't have a green image, but what you can see is that on the right corner, on the bottom of the image, you have a big hydroelectric dam, right, that will furnish energy for Manaus. You have this white line in the middle, cutting to the middle of the territory of the Waimiri, is one of the main roads that were carved out in Amazonia. You see these white patches, also some plantations that were implemented. And with this series of arrows that you are seeing, they mark the plan of forced removals of numerous villages that were populated, that populated the middle of the forest. So basically what the government was doing was attracting this population and concentrating them in some of these indigenous posts, as you could see in the film. Although they were not as pleasant as they look like in the film, there are some field testimonies that could enter this area during the military regime would say that indigenous people continue to be punished in this post. So, but the main idea here is that they were somehow forcibly displaced, evicted from their lands, from their villages. 37, please. So during this process, when this so-called Waimiri Atuari Attraction Front starts, there is a sort of massive population reduction. In 1983, when they are completely pacified and all of the survivors, which did amount just for 332 people, they had already been concentrated in those state-controlled settlements. So there's a sort of massive, sharp decline in a very short period of time. But what's the problem to access the scale of violence against these people only through these statistics is that these statistics, in fact, did not exist. They were not precise in this area, right? Insofar as this area was somehow outside the state, right? It was an area marginal to the apparatus of state control and all the means of the state to govern land and people, cartographies, maps, statistics, even all the science as ethnography, for example, they were not present there. So we cannot really have a scope of the destruction by only looking to these numbers, because these people were somehow not citizens of the state, so there is no sort of record of their existence. Insofar as this type of violence direct to indigenous people were sort of state-making violence, right? A violence which sought to implement the state in those areas. 38, please. So this is one of the few evidence that of the destruction of one of the Waimiri village. We know by some testimonies that lots of their villages were attacked with chemical attacks from the air. So indigenous people would say that their parents were burned by a sort of chemical powder. Launched from the air. We know also that by some testimonies of the survivors that some houses were razed on the ground by arson or just destroyed, but we don't have evidence of this process of destruction. Neither we can say how many villages were there. That is to say, it's a type of violence that's nearly invisible, not only in terms of the traditional means of assessing violence, but also in terms of its history, right? So it also tends to fade into memory. 39, please. Okay, so one of the main questions that we are asking in this investigation was how come that such a scale of violence that decimated almost 90% of the population cannot be registered? How come that a massive destruction that completely disrupted their means of existence, their ways of dwelling the landscape, that destroyed that village, left no ruins, left no trace, no evidence in the landscape? Now, to assume that all those villages left no trace in the landscape, that it completely disappeared, is somehow a way of perpetrating the genocide by other means, right? Insofar as you are almost erasing the history of these people a second time and saying, well, in fact, their modes of inhabitation were so primitive, right, that it could be erased very easily, and they left no trace in the landscape. So somehow you are perpetrating the genocide by other means, but you are also restate a sort of colonial ideology that would treat these people as technological backward and primitive to the extent that they could not leave any trace in the landscape. So we departed from a different epistemological frame. We say, well, by definition, they must have left a ruin, that their modes of inhabitation, their territory must left a ruin in the landscape. The problem is, it's the very nature of the ruin that's radically different. So we should try to look to these ruins in the very forest itself. So we start to look for a technology that could allow us to map the forest. And we are working with this, what is called a second forest mapping or forest age mapping, which is a means for you to map the history of the forest somehow, right? For you to map different patches or different ages or different formations, different botanical typologies of the forest. Now, this technique is important and was developed in order to map the global carbon cycle, because different types of trees different types of botanical arrangements, different age of forest, if it's a very old forest or if it's a forest that has grown over a pasture. It holds different types of roots, different types of stems, different types of leaves, of canopy, which translates in different biomass, and biomass is carbon, right? So rainforest is one of the most important biomass carbon stocks that we have in the world. So in order for you to compute the sort of flux between atmosphere and land of carbon in the forest, you need to know with much more accuracy the history of the forest itself. So slide 40, please. So when you apply this technique to, usually so this technique is applied in this type of region, which is a region somehow already very modified by humans. So when you apply this algorithm, this filter technique, right? If you go to page 41, so here we are trying to map the history of the forest, the age of the forest. So you see, for example, that on the top of this image, you have a large patch of 22 to 23 years old forest. But if we go to the image 40, can we go back and forth, Pedro, 40 and 41? You can see that in the traditional satellite image, it appears as a normal forest, but in fact, it's a very young forest, whereas the forest next to it, it's very old growth forest, right? So you can see that the forest itself, there's also always this arrangements of different ages of forest that our eyes or traditional satellite or cartographies cannot really identify. Image 42, please. So we try to do the same, for example, in one of the regions where you have contemporary indigenous villages, which are those little marks in the landscape. If you apply the same filter to this area, which is image 43, you see that these villages are not just these little bubbles that you see in a traditional satellite image, but somehow they leave a much larger patch over the landscape, right? So you see that there is a sort of movement in this landscape. So if you could go back and forth, Pedro, also for people to see the difference. Okay, now image 44. So we apply the same technique in this area, which is one of the areas where there are testimonies that some villages were destroyed. If we go to image 45, so what we start to see is that some bubbles, some bubble-shaped, oval-shaped patches of very old forest, at least 30 years old. Go to image 46, Pedro. We start to see that these very old secondary forest formations start to appear. 47. This is the region of the Balbina Dam. There are evidence that there were at least between 10 to 9 villages or even more in this area. When you apply the filter, you see that also, image 48, please. You see that also these bubble patches of secondary forest formations start to appear. Image 49, please. 50. Now they have a certain geometry. They have a certain relation. They're usually positioned in relation to a river stream in a sort of kind of close, kind of defined cluster. Image 51. They form some sort of clusters of this bubble shaped. Image 52. Some could really reach extensive areas. Image 53, 54, 55. So when we analyze in relation to the archival image to ethnographic information, and with some of the field image of the Kenya that we have record of, these patterns, these shapes, they are somehow remarkably consistent with the ethnographic information, because those villages, they were not only rigorously sort of geometric, they're also very mobile. So people would leave those lands periodically and would move to another area, right? So if we go back, for example, to the slide number 52, you could see that somehow this movement of these villages are registered in the landscape, right? By this very regrowth, the regrowth of the forest over the villages that were abandoned. But in the case of the military regime, there are also indications of the destruction of these villages. 56, please. So what is interesting is that when you look to a territorial dimension, a kind of forest landscape that look completely homogeneous, it is in fact number 57. It's in fact dotted by all these oval-shaped patches of secondary forest formations. 58. And they form several clusters, somehow organized according to the streams of the river, which is also it's a sort of graphic pattern of the information that is very consistent with the modes of being of other Caribbean-speaking indigenous groups like the Waimedia Tuareg. So what we see somehow in these maps are the scale of destruction of a certain pattern mode of inhabitation that was articulated by these networks of villages distributed through these fluvial channels of communication, right? So one problem of identifying the secondary forest formations at first place is that they are not only spectrally similar from the point of cartography, right? But they are also, let's say, similar from the point of the botanical and biodiversity of the forest itself, right? So they are really similar. But nonetheless, they are sort of almost cultural constructions. So this impossibility of revealing, of seeing the secondary forest formations that look almost or equally as natural forests or old growth forests that we can inside the mapping mechanism, this sort of optical blindness of the mapping mechanism was somehow correlative to an epistemic bias in the way that we read these landscapes, because we thought that they were completely natural. But in fact, they are really influenced by these modes of inhabitation. So these forests are what is called cultural forests. And I want to explain a little bit about this forest. I want to show you an interview with an ethnobotanist called Nigel Smith, which has been working around those issues.
Realize that this forest was not a virgin forest. I always had this romantic idea that humans were, destroyers of the forest, that they were reducing biodiversity. And so over time I began to realize the forests I've been walking through the rubber tape huts. So when they left, these weren't even farmers, they were just transitory people on the landscape. Even transitory people on the landscape can make a difference to the forest. So I've been looking at that more on a qualitative, not quantitative basis. I've been seeing what ways this is happening. Abandoned home sites, abandoned fields. In Brazil they call them roças, in Brazil they call them chacras. In other parts of Latin America they call them conucos or fincas. These are abandoned fields, and the forest, when it comes back, it's not the same forest because they've been planting trees in their fields After the annual crops finish, it's a turnover into two perennial crops, fruit trees primarily. Plus birds and animals drop seeds in the open spaces that people have created. So what happens when the forest comes back, it's actually kind of an orchard, kind of a man-made orchard. And for the untrained eye, it's not obvious. But the more I've been working in the Amazon for 43 years, and it took me a while for me to realize that this forest was not a virgin forest. I always had this romantic idea that humans were, destroyers of the forest, that they were reducing biodiversity. And so over time I began to realize the forests that I've been walking through I think again, we're foreigners or people who don't know the Amazon will come to the Amazon and imagine the place is rich in biodiversity, which it is. And I think the assumption is that the biodiversity is richest in areas where people are not, where there's no people around or have not been people around. Somehow an idea of this mythical idea of the pristine wilderness. But humans have recreated biodiversity. They've rearranged the biological furniture. So, for example, in their agricultural systems, there's a lot of what we call agrobiodiversity. They actually have a lot of different plants in their fields. It's not just the big fields of potatoes, which they don't grow in the Amazon, but if you look at European or American agriculture, you usually have big fields of a single crop. Or even in Brazil, you have maybe soybeans going for as far as the eye can see. Well, that's not traditional farming systems. Traditional farming systems are agroforestry systems, with lots of different plants in there. And so the agriculture doesn't necessarily simplify, it just creates another kind of diversity, another kind of biodiversity, you see. You've got a mosaic. The landscape is a mosaic. It's not big fields that are cultivated with tractors and mechanical and herbicides and pesticides. One of the reasons that they put a lot of crops in there is that they don't have pesticides and don't have herbicides. And you don't want to put all your money on one crop in case it fails. If you put everything into one crop and it fails, you're stuck. So they have deliberately, it's like investors in economics. They invest in different stocks so that in case one fails, they have other backups. So this is one reason that it's a very biodiverse system, because they can't go running down and get help from the government, as they say in Brazil, vai passar fome, you're going to be hungry. So this is a co-evolution of the forest. There's a really good Venezuelan anthropologist called Egli Zen who works in Caracas. And she's a very creative thinker. She has wrote a beautiful article, and she says, in the Orinoco Basin in the Guianas, the indigenous people are agents of creative disturbance. I like that term. Agents of creative disturbance. So they're not destroyers of the rainforest. They are just simply recreating it. It's part of their social fabric.
Okay. There's slide number 60. Yeah. One before. Yeah, we see a guy, right? Okay, so this idea that indigenous people recreate biodiversity is not romantic. It's in fact ethnographically verified. Those are cultural forests of Amazonia, and as you can see in this image, and you saw in the video, for some types of shape of the canopy or the forestic structure, certain patterns of vegetation distribution, these are index of this landscape. And some people, ethnobotanists specifically, they can really identify that. In some indigenous group, they have a name for this forest, which they know that were places of former villages, likewise the Kapur, which called this old villages, which have become forests as taper. Image 61. So this ethnobotanist also identifies some sort of anthropogenic index in the landscape. Palm trees, image 62. Palm trees are also other very important index of human interference. Image 63, please. Until very recently, the relations between nature and society in Amazonia were framed by scientific descriptions dominated by social evolutionist theories, which portray the region as a hostile environment populated by dispersed and demographically reduced tribes constrained by harsh environmental determinants, and therefore unable to overcome primitive stage of social-political organizations. An important fact supporting these views was precisely the lack of urbanism, right, or the lack of index showing traces of urbanization, which are, what this kind of form of complex societies. New evidence, both ethnobotanical and archaeological, are demonstrated that, in fact, the opposite is the truth. There are multiple architectural records, multiple ruins in the forest landscape, right? But the problem is that the very nature of these ruins is that different from the way we interpret the ruins of other cities, right? So some of this evidence you can see, for example, in page 63, which are these called geoglyphs, for example. I can see that the legend, the caption is wrong. These are very large architectural ceremonial constructions. Image 64, please. This is very common in Amazonia, that you deforestate an area and you encounter, in fact, that this was a completely anthropogenized, completely cultural landscape rather than a forest natural landscape. Image number 65, please. Another very important trace of anthropogenic forests in Amazonia, sites of former occupation, are the very land, the very soil itself. So this black soil, it's called dark earth, dark soil, black soil, is also one of the most important evidence of past human interference in the landscape. Okay, so here I conclude. So again, the problem is that the nature of this spatial evidence, as we could see in the sort of remote sensing archaeology of the history of the forest, and the ruins of the forms of inhabitation that were destroyed by modern colonialism, are radically different, seemingly disappearing in the middle of the forest, i.e. they are part of the very structural composition of the forest. By reading trees, soil, and botanical morphologies as evidence of past human interference, these archaeologists reveal the deeply political, anthropogenic nature of the living forest of Amazonia as an environment historically shaped by human conflicts. It's somehow that we have to interpret Amazonia as through the lens of architectural syntax, right? As almost a kind of encoded, manipulated, constructed by social actions, a kind of urban environment in a certain sense, whose modes of organization are articulated in a very particular mode, which challenge the very category of the city itself. So the sort of alterity of Amazonia in relation to cultural environment is not the opposite of the saturated cultural domain of cities, but it's a kind of very radically different form of spatial organization, to which the production of biodiversity is contingent to an entire mode of inhabitation. And Pedro, just to conclude, I think we could put, I think I went very much over my time, but we could just screen a little bit of the interview with Heckenberg. Just the 5 minutes.
As I pointed out to, ethnographer colleagues time and again, including Philippe and Eduardo Viveras and their students and others, their corpus of materials is derived entirely from the 20th century. And if you accept mine and other arguments about the massive impacts of European colonialism and how the Amazon didn't insulate them from what happened in North America and Mexico and Peru that devastated indigenous populations, they're using a sample during the period that I call the demographic nadir. So you're just using the Xingu as an example. They were 50,000 people or more 500 years ago. In 1950, there was 500. Almost all the major ethnographies were written from the 1950s to the 1970s or 80s. So you've got this curve going like this, and if you take the ethnographies as a description of traditional Xinguano society, that's traditional Xinguano society. So the argument that I make is if you wanted to do an ethnography of traditional Central European Jewish society, it's like going and interviewing people at Dachau and saying, this is traditional society. They're in an absolute state of social and physical and demographic crisis. They're on the ropes. They're almost going extinct. And that's traditional society. There's elements of it that are true. And the thing of it is there's this methodological question. I can't interrogate things 100 or 500 years ago the way that Philippe or Eduardo or another ethnographer might interrogate the present. Be studying the present. And so for somebody interested in the type of stuff that I'm interested in, when that GPS technology became available and also linked with satellite image analysis, all of a sudden there's this new panorama that we could understand things from an evidentiary basis. You know, not just, oh, well, we think this, or this seems good, or we've got one example there. We could have physical, very clear evidence. And everything that you saw there today is, you know, this is not my imagination. You know, galactic clusters and garden cities, and you know, I've also talked about fractal persons, you know, where you sleep in a hammock and how the house is laid out in the village, that I describe as a kind of a fractal quality of things. Some of the terms, you know, yes, I've been creative with the terms, but not in coming up with the arguments. The arguments have come from the evidence itself. You know, there is an earthwork, just map it out. And as we did that, it's just all of a sudden, it's like, my God, you know, this is literally, it's all planned out. You just could not have gotten lost in the pre-Columbian Xingu landscape. It's you know, it's not quite downtown Manhattan, but it's more like downtown Manhattan than your average Grecian polis was. In Amazonia, the indigenous people have always been defined based on the absence of something. They don't have writing, they don't have cities, they don't have domesticated animals, they don't have this. It's like they lack this, they lack this, they lack this, they lack this. Therefore, they're less than the societies that have those things. Now, of course, in the first place, the people who came up with that list are Europeans talking about their own history. And so they've kind of stacked the deck. You know this term? Jogando cartas, you stack the deck so it's a favor de você. So the city, for example, is defined based on what Europeans from their own historical experience expect the city to be. It's not only that we amplify what the definition of the city is, it's almost like there's two alter ego cities, you know, involved, and they're the photographic negative of the big oasis cities. Now, a big oasis city, you got everybody packed into one place. And so the buildings get taller and the streets, you know, get more cobbled and, you know, everybody's packed in there and they come in a very different form. That is the city of Western historical experience. So typically as people go out across the world looking for cities or not, they either have a full-blown example of that kind of a city, then it's, yes, that's urbanism, or they have something that's kind of on the way to becoming that kind of a city. And then everything else is something otherwise. It's non-urban, it's not quite as advanced or as complicated. And I think what the beauty of what Ebenezer Howard was describing was this is just a radically different way of organizing human populations on a large scale with a tremendous degree of planning and integration. That whether you want to call it urban or not is fine, but in many respects the Xingu system was more complicated and sophisticated in terms of traffic, in terms of planning and integration, than the Grecian polis, the medieval city, even many of the kind of classic examples from the Mesopotamian world and whatnot. So it's like, okay, well, if it's more complicated, how can we kind of treat it as something less? It's just fundamentally different, and I think that it is a form, the multicentric form, where you don't have a big, massive city. And I've been taken to task because I've described it as a non-city form of urbanism. And of course, many people see city and urban as the same thing. But if you actually go to the dictionary describes urbanism as towns and cities. And the Xingu system is a multicentric network of towns.
What do you call galactic?
Galactic urbanism.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's enough for me. Yeah, thank you very much for hearing all this.
Okay, thank you for staying through the whole session. It was a long session, but we're still having some questions. So I'd first like to open up to you in case you have any question to Deneb or also Paulo's online. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions. And then any questions? I guess not. How do you feel? Do you want to keep going? So just to be brief then, there was, the first thing I kind of was thinking was in both talks, that in both talks, you can only access the Earth through technology, as if you are never you can never really be in nature if not through a sort of mediation.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be my first question, this idea of the necessity of a technological filter.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question might be this transition from horizontality to verticality, because you mentioned disorientation in the horizontal plane, and then Paulo kind of uses the verticality to see deeper into the landscape. So this will be my 2 points, if you have anything to comment.
I think the use of technology or the inevitability of technology, in terms of mediation, I think, of course, I'm tracing particularly the Western and of course Latin American, insofar as Latin America also has its own culture of modernity, the way in which in a way nature is seen as precisely that which is beyond technology, or maybe that which resists technology. I think at least in my work, what I'm trying to think in terms of these images, the ways in which the vocabulary that needs to be crafted to describe the Amazon as well. I mean, especially if you're coming from a perspective of literature, and I'm not just interested in fiction and being also interested in nonfiction. As soon as you start trying to describe that place, you need a sort of, and depending if you wanna, Euclides da Cunha, for example, that on the one hand tries to be like has a sort of like realistic strain, and then on the other hand, also trying to emphasize the sort of like the unrealistic and like wondrous like aspect of the Amazon. There's a way in which the realism is not produced as that which is already taken which is already given, but you also need to, it's by making explicit the medium and the technique through which you're accessing it that you kind of produce reality. So that's also in a way how I'm looking at these technologies, so to speak, as on the one hand kind of like giving the idea that they can kind of see nature, and that there's a sort of, like by stepping outside through technology in a way, you're kind of like seeing the Amazonian environment as it is, so to speak. And of course, with photography, especially in the early 20th century, very much still has that appeal. And on the other hand, how it also completely like goes on the other way, which is like it creates a modality of like abstraction. And the other thing I think that this question raises is the way in which nature is conflated with immersion. Because, of course, if you, like looking at the indigenous person as like being bound to the ground, so to speak, I mean, in at least the way in which the indigenous seems to kind of like occupy the like pole of nature, whereas, you know, Western civilization and technology is like on the pole of like culture, so to speak. What, in a way, I'm trying to like not only avoid but like investigate is this conflation of like immersion with nature, or like boundedness to the land with it. Because I think in a way, like if we are actually to think of like how technology can potentially like be used precisely like to show that, you know, I mean, any engagement with nature is not necessarily a sort of like, it can no longer be defined as an like absence or extrication from technology. So that's why I like also emphasize like there's like different semiotic levels. And I mean, I just showed like one article, but in my research, I try to kind of like be explicit and also like develop a language to talk about how images and also the text themselves, the way that the travelers are conceiving of that space, create a sort of like stratification of it. And of course, I mean, in terms of, you could also think of like nature, so to speak, in the naturalist sense, which would be the scientist sense, right? Which is like very much a kind of still in a way like would be caught up in a kind of 19th century like project of like cataloging the Amazon and like getting all the species down and trying to understand in a way, also like make an inventory of that place, which is also in a way kind of like not exactly like the definition that I'm aiming at. And I think the question of verticality and horizontality, I am trying to understand also in like what the way that I'm like conceiving the geophilosophical aspect of the project has to do with the coordinates between like water, land, air, and the ways in which like movement itself is described, and how the description of this movement in a way kind of creates this kind of, brings to the fore the kind of like kinetic sphere of the Amazon. And of course, in a lot of the descriptions of the travelers, they describe the indigenous person, so to speak, as like moving either like a serpent, because the indigenous subject obviously like knows that space so well and like knows how to actually navigate with it. And the comparisons are usually like, well, a novice that would just be traveling here for the first time would get absolutely like entangled by the forest. And of course, the European and even like the Latin American fear is to get completely absorbed and like lose any actual like, you know, axis of orientation in there. And at the same time, like the comparison of like movement of like the serpent, the indigenous movement with the serpent is itself not necessarily like semiotically translatable into like a vertical or a horizontal axis itself. So I'm in the readings that I'm doing and like trying to kind of like not formalize in a way, but conceive of these like coordinates and these dispositions. And I think in a way also that's something I started thinking also because of the idea of like what a falling sky was. And just because like the airplane, the railway, and water navigation are like the main modes, the initial modes of like access to the Amazon, like prior to walking, like because walking is also something dangerous. It's not something you do extensively. So even trying to understand how all of these ways of like navigation actually combine with each other and what kind of like empirical realm they create. I think it's interesting in a way because just like looking at like the images that Paulo was showing from his archive that, I mean, precisely because they're satellite, they do also become extremely flat, right? I mean, especially also once they go from, like they're not always, like when they go from different kinds of cartography and like data mapping, there's a way in which also I think we conceive of these maps as being kind of superimposed, so to speak. But I think what we need to think of is like thinking of them as being more dimensional rather than this kind of like stacking or stratified understanding of like, of like different forms of mapping. So, yeah. Thank you.
Should we close? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for coming. And there's another event Thursday, which will be on animals in contemporary arts and animal politics.
Yeah.
If you want to join then. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.